Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions series on how to write a great research paper. In this series, we'll be providing you with all the tools you need to write a research paper that will get you a high score and will impress your teacher, even if you've never written a research paper before. In this program, we'll be talking about the first step in the process, which may well be the most important step, picking an A-plus topic. But before we begin, we need to consider our overall purpose. What is a research paper, and what does your teacher have in mind in asking you to create one? Well, we define a research paper as a paper that presents an original approach to some academic topic, organized around a central thesis, using insights based on research and citing sources in a scholarly fashion. Let's take that definition apart and consider it point by point, because each element is important. First, a research paper is an original approach to some academic topic. Let's start with the last part of that phrase. An academic topic is a topic studied in schools by university professors and by scholars, around which a discipline and a body of literature have grown up. So you can see a research paper is different from other kinds of writing that you may do for school. Your own life isn't an academic topic, so a story that you write about your own experiences wouldn't qualify as a research paper. Neither are your opinions about music or current events or your philosophy of life or an imaginary narrative that you might write in the form of a story or a screenplay. So any of these kinds of writings which you might be asked to do in some classes in school would not qualify as a research paper. An original approach means that a research paper doesn't just repeat information from other sources. Sometimes students make that mistake. They're so preoccupied with the idea of having to make their material based on research that they forget that their own approach, their own ideas are at least as important. It's not just about regurgitating material that you may read somewhere else. It's about giving your own spin. So a research paper should offer your ideas about the topic, one or more personal reactions, opinions, or conclusions that grow out of the academic topic. And as we work through this series, we'll see exactly how you want to develop your own ideas based on the research and reading that you do. Now, we also said in our definition that a research paper is organized around a central thesis. What does this mean? Well, your central thesis is the main idea that anchors your paper. It states what you most want to say about the topic, the big idea that you've come up with after reading and thinking about the topic. In a good research paper, every fact or idea that's mentioned has some relationship to this central thesis. It may help to explain it, to clarify it, to support it, to challenge it, to amplify it, to elaborate it, or to suggest its importance. Everything that's in the paper ought to fit in with the central thesis in some way. That will give you a well-organized and unified paper. Throughout this series, we'll be talking about the importance of a strong central thesis, how to develop one, how to support it with evidence, and how to present it convincingly. Now, the next part of our definition says that a research paper is written using insights based on research. Now, what's research? Well, research means reading and study of various kinds of evidence, mainly but not exclusively drawn from written materials. Research may be based on all kinds of source materials. Here are some examples of the kinds of things that could be included under the general heading of research. Research may be based on printed materials such as books, scholarly journals, magazines, and newspapers. It may be based on written materials that are not printed, such as unpublished diaries, court records or government records, or the notes of a scientist or a reporter. Research may be based on spoken materials, such as a face-to-face interview that you do with someone, or a recording of a speech, lecture, concert, or broadcast. Research may be based on visual materials, such as photographs, drawings, paintings, or other works of art, maps, diagrams, graphs, charts, or tables. And of course, nowadays, research may be based on digital documents, especially materials on the internet, including web pages, digitized books and articles, online publications, or blogs. Now, what do all these sources have in common? They all contain information of various kinds. And when you write a research paper, you're practicing the skill of gathering information, analyzing it, sorting it, drawing conclusions from it and explaining and demonstrating those conclusions in written form. And that's what creating a research paper is all about. And all of these processes add up to something called scholarship. And we'll be talking in this program about what the concept of scholarship is and how it fits into the work you do in creating a research paper for school. Later in this series, we'll look very closely at the techniques of research, including modern online techniques that take advantage of all the electronic resources that are now available. And we'll explain how to find good sources of information for your paper and how to use them appropriately. The final part of our definition says that when you write a research paper, you need to cite sources in a scholarly fashion. Well, we used the word scholarship a moment ago. What is scholarship? Scholarship is what scholars do, and scholars are people who practice the arts of scholarship, who operate in a scholarly way, which means building new knowledge by analyzing and learning from what others have done and adding fresh insights to it. Now, when I say scholars, what do you think of? What kind of person does that bring to mind? Of course, many scholars work as college and university professors, and those are the folks who are most often described as scholars. And scholarship is often defined as what college and university professors do. But when you think about it, many people who do scholarly research also have different kinds of jobs. For example, there are people doing scholarly work who work in private business, for example, as researchers for technology companies such as pharmaceutical or computer firms. Some people who do scholarly work in government. For example, there are CIA analysts whose job is to study foreign cultures so that we can anticipate what's likely to happen overseas in terms of political or economic developments. Some scholars work in not-for-profit organizations such as think tanks or advocacy groups. And still other scholars are journalists, filmmakers, or book authors. What all of these people share is the practice of reading, study, and other forms of research which they then use to develop conclusions and ideas which they share with others in written form. So this broad population of people can all be defined as scholars. What they do is scholarship, and when you write a research paper, you're participating in the same kind of activity that all these people spend their lives doing. Together, these people, whom we could loosely call scholars, have created a culture of scholarship that has evolved over time. It includes a set of practices that encourages people to build knowledge based on other people's work. And that means making it easy for others to see how and where one scholar is borrowing ideas or information from another. And this is what we mean by citing sources. It simply means telling people who read your work where you got the information from, and doing it according to specific standardized forms that we'll be explaining later in this series. So when your teacher asks you to write a research paper and to cite your sources in a scholarly fashion, he or she is not just being fussy for no good reason. The idea is that you're participating in this larger community of scholars. You're contributing a little bit of knowledge to the vast body of information that has been developed over generations by all these scholars in all these different walks of life. And to communicate clearly with others in the scholarship community, you need to write in their language. And in this series, we'll teach you how to do that. Now, the length of a typical research paper varies greatly depending on the purpose. We've given some indication of the many varied forms that research can take, and that certainly affects the format and length of the kinds of writing that scholars will do under the guise of a research paper. Some scholarly magazines or journals may publish research papers that are very short, just 3 to 5 pages in length. By contrast, a PhD thesis, which is the lengthy scholarly or research paper that someone would do in order to earn a doctor's degree, such a thesis is usually hundreds of pages long, the equivalent of a book. In this series, we'll be assuming that you're writing a research paper that's 10 to 15 double-spaced pages in length, which probably means about 3,000 to 5,000 words. This is the length of a typical term paper for an upper-level high school or lower-level college course. And we'll assume that that's the kind of paper that you're being asked to write. Most students who are asked to write a research paper for the first time will probably have to write something of about that length. Now, if you are a high school or college student, you may be wondering at this point, why do you need to learn to write a research paper? After all, you may say, I'm probably not going to become a college or university teacher, so I'm probably not going to spend my life as a scholar. Why is it necessary for me to learn to write the language of scholarship and play act being a scholar for the purposes of writing this paper? Well, those points are valid, but there are three good reasons we can think of why learning to write a research paper is important and therefore required of almost every high school and college student. Let's take a quick look at these three reasons. First, education, of course, is about the value of knowledge, and a research paper is all about uncovering knowledge and building upon it. So the ability to do research and use it intelligently in writing is a basic tool of any educated person. And this is why, over the years, high schools and colleges have agreed that being able to write a research paper is important for any educated person. You need to be able to draw information from many sources and organize it thoughtfully in a piece of writing. That indicates that you understand what you've read and have made it your own and contributed to the advancement of knowledge in some small degree yourself. So part of being educated is being able to write a good research paper, and that's why it's required in most schools. Second, there are actually practical life reasons why being able to do effective research may be important for you. In today's economy, which is often called the knowledge economy, more and more people are using research skills in their daily work. University scholar Jacques Barzoun once defined an intellectual as anyone who carries a briefcase to work. That's a pretty broad definition, and by that definition, you could say that we live today in a world of intellectuals, since more and more people don't work with their hands, but instead work with their minds and with ideas, carrying a briefcase to work and working on a computer and wrestling with words and information on a daily basis. The point is that working with facts, information, and ideas is a fundamental category of work today, and the chances are good that you'll be doing that kind of work in your lifetime. So if you're going to participate in the knowledge economy, the skills that are involved in writing a good research paper will be useful to you in your daily life, even if you're not a university professor. Finally, understanding how to analyze, evaluate, criticize, combine, and draw conclusions from information sources is crucial to everyday decisions, including decisions like what products to buy, who to vote for, where to live, what job to take, and what government policies to support. Think about it. Anytime you face a complex decision like one of these, what do you have to do? Well, you have to read sources of information, which may be from newspapers, magazines, guidebooks. They may be online. You need to figure out who's telling the truth. Which resource do you believe? Who do you think is most authoritative? You need to combine ideas that may differ or disagree with one another. Figure out which one is most accurate and put it all together in a way that makes sense so that you can then make the decision that's best for you. All of these are research and thinking skills, which are very much like those that are involved in writing a research paper. So it may be that in your life, the most important thing you ever research is what car to drive or what house to buy. Even if that's the only kind of research you ever go on to do, you'll be glad that you've developed research skills like the ones that we'll be teaching in this series. Now that you understand what a research paper is and why it's an important skill to develop, you're ready to begin thinking about how to create a great research paper. And that starts with choosing an A+ topic, which is a surprisingly challenging thing to do. Now, in most cases, the general subject of your research paper has been assigned or suggested by your teacher. But a subject is not the same thing as a topic, and it's important to understand the difference. The subject that your teacher assigns is usually just a starting point. You have to do a fair amount of work to create a true topic from within that subject area. And once you have a topic, you'll need to focus on a particular question that you want to answer relating to that topic. Finally, you'll have to develop a thesis, which is the main idea you want to state about that topic in relation to the question. All of this is necessary before you actually write your paper. Let's take a few minutes to distinguish these four key elements: subject, topic, question, and thesis. Let's begin by talking about what kinds of subjects teachers usually assign. Very often, your teacher will simply say, you're going to have to write a research paper for this class. Consider that your term paper. It will have to be such and such a length, and it will need to be drawn from a topic that we discuss somewhere in this class. In many cases, you'll be given very broad latitude in defining exactly what subject and topic you want to write about. In other cases, the teacher may give you a more specific subject. The teacher may indicate the kind of question that he or she wants you to focus on, or may give you a general subject from within the coursework. For example, suppose you were taking a course in American history, and in the first semester or the first half of that year-long course, the most important subject that you discussed was the American Civil War and the important impact that it had on our nation's history. Well, your teacher might say, I want you to write a term paper, a research paper that deals in some way with Abraham Lincoln, who was, of course, the president who presided during the Civil War. That would be the subject of your paper, Abraham Lincoln. Notice how broad it is. A subject is usually broad enough so that it could be covered in books of many hundreds of pages, and probably has been. In fact, Abraham Lincoln is the person about whom more has been written than almost anyone in history. There are literally thousands of books that have been written about many different aspects of Abraham Lincoln's life and work. So as a broad general subject, Abraham Lincoln is fine. It would never work as a topic for a research paper, because remember, a research paper of 10 to 15 pages is going to need to be focused much more narrowly. Otherwise, there's no way you could adequately cover the material in just 10 to 15 pages. A subject, then, is a very broad category, a broad, sweeping definition of the kinds of things you're going to need to write about. You need to take the subject and narrow it down quite a bit before you can create an actual topic which defines what your paper is really about. So a topic, as compared to a subject, is a much more specific focus within the general subject area. The topic is usually something that you develop. The teacher hands you a broad subject and says, you come up with a topic. Paradoxically, it's a surprising thing that many students don't realize when they first get into writing research papers. In most cases, the narrower the topic, the more interesting and rich the paper can actually be. So if you want to create an interesting piece of writing that is filled with illuminating ideas and details, defining your topic rather narrowly will prove to be quite important. One of the most fundamental mistakes that many students make when they write their first research paper is that they try to write about a topic that's too broad, a topic that in fact is more like a general subject area rather than a specific topic. Let's go back to the American history class. Let's say your teacher has asked you to write something about Abraham Lincoln. Well, you need to define the topic more narrowly. And there are many, many ways you could do this. You could write something about Lincoln's views on slavery. You could write something about the political tactics that he employed. You could write something about his psychology. There have been authors writing lately about the fact that Lincoln may have suffered from clinical depression. You could write about that. You could write about Lincoln's marriage. There are any number of specific topics within the broad general subject of Lincoln that you could choose to write about. What they all have in common is that they take that broad general subject area and define a much more narrow area of interest within the broad subject, and that's the topic. Let's say that you are interested in how Lincoln got to be elected president in the first place, because it was a rather unlikely election. He wasn't terribly well known throughout the country, and his point of view wasn't accepted by all the voters. So you might choose to make your topic the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. That's a workable kind of topic for a 10 to 15 page research paper. And that's the first way to begin judging an appropriate topic for your research paper. Does it describe a topic area that can be covered adequately and interestingly in just 10 to 15 pages? If you've never written something that long, 10 to 15 pages may sound like a lot, but once you begin the research and actually start writing, you'll find that there's a limit to what you can say and what you can cover in just 10 to 15 pages, which is like a single chapter from a book as compared to the breadth of a lengthy entire book. There's a severe limit to what you can cover in a 10 to 15 page paper, and that's why your topic needs to be defined rather narrowly. The election of Lincoln in 1860 works pretty well for a paper of this length. Now, once you've got a topic, you next need to define a question that you want to answer in writing your paper. The best topics are usually built around intriguing questions that the student actually is interested in answering. So here's one possible question that you might want to ask yourself about Lincoln's election in 1860. Here's the question: how did Lincoln, an obscure politician from the Midwest, win the crucial 1860 election against better-known competitors? Once again, this works well for a paper of 10 to 15 pages in length. It's the kind of question that could probably be answered reasonably well in a paper of that length. If you were going to write about a much broader topic, the questions would be equally broad and, again, almost impossible to answer in just 10 to 15 pages. For example, there have been many full-length biographies of Lincoln built around the question, what made Lincoln a great president? And there's so much to say about that, about his personality, his political skills, his reaction to the great issues of his day, and so on and so forth. There's so much to say there that you almost need to write 300 pages to answer that question effectively. This much narrower question, focused just on how Lincoln managed to win the 1860 election, is something that could be covered reasonably well in just 10 to 15 pages. It's an interesting question as well, and therefore it'll work well in helping us to define what our paper is going to be about. Finally, before you actually write the paper, you will need a thesis. And as we've mentioned, the thesis states what you want to say about the topic. It's your conclusion based on your research and thought. Remember what we said earlier in the program. A research paper isn't just about what other people have written and thought. It's about your ideas, your opinions, and your conclusions concerning the topic. So it's not enough to just do a lot of reading and then regurgitate it on the page. Instead, you've got to come up with your own conclusions and ideas and opinions and state them in a thesis. A strong thesis, one that makes for a good research paper, can usually be stated in a single sentence. Here's an example of a thesis that you might come up with for the topic of Lincoln and the election of 1860. The thesis might go something like this: Lincoln was elected in 1860 because his ambiguous position on slavery attracted support from various groups who didn't necessarily agree with one another. We're saying here that Lincoln's position on slavery was ambiguous. In other words, it wasn't totally clear. He was somewhat opposed to slavery. He didn't believe in emancipating or freeing the slaves immediately. He did not want to antagonize the Southern slaveholders unnecessarily. So there was quite a bit of ambiguity about exactly what Lincoln stood for. And you may conclude after doing your research that this was one of the reasons that Lincoln was able to win the election of 1860. By not taking a very firm or clear stance on slavery, he was actually able to gather votes from people who didn't necessarily agree with his position, but because they weren't that sure about what his position was, they couldn't find a reason to vote against him. So this is a thesis that you might come up with after doing your reading and research into the 1860 election. We've stated it in a single sentence. It makes a particularly clear, strong argument, and it would make a good basis for a 10 to 15 page paper. Now, of course, you might come up with a very different thesis. Other people reading the same background information about Lincoln and the election of 1860 might come up with a different thesis, a different explanation as to how Lincoln managed to get elected, a different answer to that question that we came up with. And that's fine. No two students will use the same thesis in writing their paper, and that's fine. The important thing is that you do have a thesis, a statement that's clear and emphatic about exactly what you believe, what your opinion is, based on the research you've done, and then you'll build your paper around that. We'll be talking a lot more about how to build your paper around a thesis and how to support and demonstrate your thesis throughout this series. For now, the important thing to realize is that you need a strong thesis to make a good paper. The sentence that states your thesis may or may not actually appear in your final paper. That's not important. The most important thing is to have a thesis, to state it in a sentence, because that will create a focus around which you can build the entire paper. Let's consider a couple of other examples about how you would go from subject to topic to question to thesis. Suppose you were taking a course on art history and you were learning in this course all about modern 20th century painters. Matisse and Chagall and Picasso and many others. You might be asked to write a term paper about Picasso, or you might choose Picasso as simply a painter that you were particularly interested in. And so your general subject area for your research paper might be Picasso. Now, Picasso lived for many decades and created thousands of works of art, paintings, sculptures, collages, and so forth. Tremendously influential artist, worked in many different styles. There's much more to say about Picasso than could possibly be covered in a 10 to 15 page paper. He's like Lincoln in that hundreds or thousands of books have been written about Picasso. So Picasso works fine as a subject, not as a topic. You're going to need to narrow the subject a lot more before you have an area that could be covered adequately in 10 to 15 pages. Well, one way of narrowing the broad subject area of Picasso to a specific topic might be to pick one work of art and do an analysis of some aspect related to that work of art. Now, one of Picasso's most famous and influential paintings is a painting called Guernica, a painting that he painted at the time of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and it has a political motive behind it. It deals with the bombing by German forces of an ancient, very historic cultural city in Spain called Guernica. This was viewed with horror at the time. It was considered an act of barbarity by the fascists who were trying to take over Spain. And Picasso, who was a native of Spain, was deeply moved and troubled by this event. And he decided to paint the picture Guernica as an act of protest against this modern barbarity, the attack on this wonderful city that he loved. And the painting Guernica became a very influential anti-war statement. It hung for decades in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City because Picasso had given it to that museum with the proviso that it could be returned to his native Spain only after a democratic government was installed in Spain. And in fact, this did happen many years after Picasso's death, and Guernica now is in Spain. So you can see there's a rich history behind this painting of Guernica, and it would certainly make an interesting topic for a 10 to 15 page research paper. You could write quite a bit, and there'd be a lot of interesting stuff to read about this wonderful painting by Picasso. Now, you need a question to focus on. Once again, it's not enough to just have a topic, although that's an important step in the right direction. You need to think about what question am I going to try to answer in my paper that will help us lead toward a thesis, something specific that we want to say. Well, there are many things that could be asked about Guernica. How did Picasso paint it? What is the story behind his choosing this topic? How can we explain the various stylistic elements of the painting? For example, some art critics have pointed out that the painting really doesn't depict modern warfare. You don't see bombers or tanks in the picture. Instead, you see archaic symbols of war, such as the broken sword in a soldier's hand. So in an odd way, although Picasso is writing about a modern tragedy, he is using symbols and images drawn from ancient warfare. Why did Picasso choose that style? Would be an interesting question. But here's a possible question that we might use to focus our research paper about Guernica. We've said that the painting had an important political message. A question that we might ask might be, how did people respond to Guernica's political message when it first appeared? In researching this question, we would want to investigate, was the painting controversial? Were there people who hated Picasso for painting it? While did others flock to support him and his work and his political point of view? Did Guernica become a cause célèbre, something that people argued about? And the story behind all of these questions would be quite interesting to write about in your 10 to 15 page paper. So this question focuses on one aspect of the topic of Guernica, namely the response to Picasso's political message. Finally, before writing the paper, you would need to answer that question. You'd need to come up with a thesis which states your main idea in response to that question. You'd need to do the research and the reading and the study and examine the picture yourself before coming up with the thesis, but a possible statement of a thesis in response to this question might be simply this: the way in which contemporary art critics responded to the painting Guernica illustrates how politics can influence our reactions to art. What you might have found, for example, is that conservative art critics hated Guernica because they hated the message, while more liberal or progressive art critics might have loved Guernica because they loved the message. And people's reactions to the art was really colored by how they felt about the political message behind the painting. That might be what you discover from doing your research. You might come up with a different thesis and a different conclusion. Again, that's fine. Two students writing on the same topic, answering the same question, would likely come up with two different theses. The point is to come up with a thesis that strongly states a particular point of view around which the entire paper can then be built. Let's look at one more example. Suppose you were taking an anthropology course. Your general subject for a paper might be early humans, because you might be learning about prehistoric human beings, how they originated in Africa, gradually spread to fill the world. You might be learning about their culture, about the development of different physical characteristics of humans in different areas. You might be reading and studying about the invention of agriculture, the invention of metallurgy and language, and various other things that make modern human beings what they are today. So the general subject of early humans might be a broad category of subject area within which you need to define a specific topic. Okay, you might have discovered from your work in the course that the question of when human beings first came to the Americas has become a controversial one in recent years. So you might want to choose a topic based on that. Since you might be from America, you might be particularly interested in how early humans first came to America. So you might choose a topic something like this: the spread of early humans from Eurasia into the Americas. So that's your topic. Notice how much narrower it is than the broad general subject of early humans. Now we've defined a topic area that's narrow enough so that 10 to 15 pages might be enough to cover it pretty well. Now we need a question, something that we're interested in finding out about this topic. The question might be something like, how has our understanding of the spread of early humans into the Americas changed in recent years? In other words, you might be curious about what the most recent findings are. Archaeologists and scholars are constantly finding new sites where early humans first lived in America, with arrowheads and tools and signs of ancient fires, all of which add little by little to our knowledge of early humans in the Americas. So you might be interested in writing a paper based on research into what those most recent findings are. What are the new discoveries, and what do they tell us about early humans in the Americas? And after doing your research, you'd need to come up with a thesis that summarizes in a sentence the main point of the paper, your main answer to the question. Here's a possible thesis. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that humans migrated from Eurasia into the Americas thousands of years earlier than formerly believed. In other words, the timeline that historians and scholars now assume to be true has been changing quite a bit as new evidence has been discovered. It seems that humans came into the Americas much earlier than was previously thought. And you could write a nice 10 to 15 page paper summarizing the recent studies, why scholars are changing their minds about the timeline, and all of that could be explained quite nicely in 10 to 15 pages. Well, now that you've seen the difference between a broad subject and a narrower topic, the question that you want to ask about the topic, and the thesis, which answers that question, now that you understand what these 4 steps are in creating a paper, you might be wondering, how do I get from subject to topic and ultimately to thesis? Well, the first step is reading around your subject and narrowing your research focus based on what you learn. Reading around your subject means doing background reading, which will help you to come up with a specific topic that interests you, that seems to have potential for a good paper, where there are good research sources available, and where you think you'd be able to write something that you'd enjoy writing and which would add something to your own knowledge and perhaps even to the knowledge of the world. So reading around the subject means immersing yourself to a degree in the general subject area, learning as much as you can about it, so that you can then come up with some more specific topic ideas based on your preliminary knowledge of the broad subject. Now, of course, your practice of reading around the subject has really begun just by taking the particular class that you're taking for which you've been asked to write this research paper. You've undoubtedly been reading all kinds of materials and listening to lectures in class about the general subject area, so your background reading has already begun. But when the time comes to write your term paper or your research paper, you'll want to do some specific focused reading around the subject area that you've been assigned for the paper to deepen your knowledge of the subject and help you choose a more specific or narrow topic within the broad subject that would work for you for writing a research paper. What are some of the good sources for this kind of background reading? Well, here are some suggestions for where to get started. First, of course, there's your course textbook. Not every class involves an assigned textbook, but many do. And if you've been given a textbook in the particular course, read the chapter or chapters that deal with the general subject area you've been asked to write about. As you read, make notes of what interests you. What questions seem to be raised by the material that you're reading about? What sorts of things would you like to learn more about? Any of those could be potential topic areas. Another good source is books that you locate by browsing your local or school library for an hour or two. How can you locate these kinds of books? Well, I'll give you some specific suggestions in a minute, but the best general way to begin would be to go to the catalog of your library, which may be available online, or it could be in card format, or ask a librarian where to locate the catalog, and find the appropriate shelf where books on the general subject area are to be found. So, for example, if you were going to be writing about Picasso's painting Guernica, you'd want to find the particular shelf where books about art history and specifically about Picasso are located. And spend an hour or two browsing that shelf. You'll probably find a handful of books about Picasso. Pull them down, flip through them, and get a sense as to which one or ones are the most interesting to you and the most likely to yield ideas for a good topic. We'll be giving you some examples about exactly how to do this. But browsing in your local library, once you've identified the appropriate shelf, is a good way of doing some background reading and finding good sources for reading around your subject. Browsing in the library works well because it allows serendipity to take place. That word serendipity means the ability to make happy discoveries by accident. People who are gifted with serendipity often come up with wonderful ideas that other people don't. And one of the good ways of giving yourself a little serendipity is to browse the library. Don't just look for a specific book that you've been told to look for. Instead, take a look at the entire related shelf. You may stumble upon a book that turns out to be a wonderful source. A third good source for your background reading is an encyclopedia article, which will provide you a short overview of current thinking about the subject. Now, here's a warning. For most term papers, an encyclopedia article would not be considered an appropriate research source. So when we get into a later stage of this series and we're talking about the actual research that you're going to do in developing your thesis and writing your paper, we are not going to recommend encyclopedia articles. Encyclopedia articles give a good once-over lightly. They're good for background reading, but not as reference sources. So you use the encyclopedia article at this stage of your research, not later in the program. We'll remind you about that, but that's important to realize. Encyclopedia articles are good basic reference tools. They are not detailed research sources on which to rely when writing your paper. Having said that, an encyclopedia article can be a very good place to start your background reading. If you know little or nothing about the subject, and sometimes teachers will assign research subjects that they are not specifically covering in class, then an encyclopedia article can be a good way of getting some general background. And an encyclopedia article, in any case, may touch on some aspects of the subject that your teacher in class has not talked about. Now, of course, there are many encyclopedias available, and your reference librarian will be happy to point out where they are in your school or local library. There are encyclopedias such as the Encyclopedia Americana, the World Book Encyclopedia, and available online is the Encarta Encyclopedia from Microsoft. Probably the most respected encyclopedia in the print world is the Encyclopedia Britannica. And let's take a moment to talk about the structure of the Encyclopedia Britannica, since I am recommending that you use the encyclopedia as a good source of background reading, and in particular, the Encyclopedia Britannica is considered the most authoritative of all encyclopedias. So I recommend you start there. Some students find the Encyclopedia Britannica confusing because of its unusual format. As you probably know, most encyclopedias are made up of articles on many different subjects arranged simply in alphabetical order. So if you were interested in reading about Picasso, you would look under the letter P, and by Jove, you'd find an article about Picasso there in virtually any encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia Britannica is a little different, and we'll look at it in more detail in a moment. But what you need to know about the Encyclopedia Britannica is that it's really divided into three parts. We're talking now about the current 15th edition, which is the one you're likely to find in any library. The three parts of the Encyclopedia Britannica are called the Propoedia, the Micropedia, and the Macropedia. What do these mean? Well, the Propoedia is a one-volume index to all the rest of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and as we'll see, it's a good place to start your reading. The Micropedia is a 12-volume reference section where you'll find short articles, sometimes just a paragraph or two in length, sometimes a page or so in length, which give basic background information on a particular topic. The Macropedia is 17 volumes in length, and it contains longer articles about topics that are particularly important. And you may find articles that are 20, 30, 40, 50 pages in length dealing with topics of special significance. Not every topic in the world will be covered in the Macropedia, because most topics aren't important enough to deserve a lengthy article like the ones that appear in that part of the encyclopedia. So you'll want to start with the Propoedia, which will give you a sense as to where your particular subject is covered elsewhere in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It may be in the Micropedia, it may be in the Macropedia, or both. One of the good things about an encyclopedia article is that, first of all, it is considered authoritative. It will generally give an unbiased point of view. When people compile encyclopedias, they are usually looking for experts to write the articles who are not particularly wedded to one point of view or another. So if you read about a topic that happens to be controversial, either politically or in any other way, you'll probably get a good mainstream point of view in an encyclopedia article, often giving both points of view about a particular topic rather than leaning heavily in one direction or another. So you'll get a good basic grounding in what most people think about a topic when you read about it in an encyclopedia article. In addition, most good encyclopedias, including the Encyclopedia Britannica, will end most of the articles with a bibliography. And a bibliography is a wonderful tool to get at this point in the process, because a bibliography is a selected list of good books and sometimes articles written about the subject. So if you were to look up Picasso in any good encyclopedia, the article about Picasso would be interesting and helpful in its own right. It would also end with a bibliography, which would give you a listing of some of the good books about Picasso that have been written in recent years. Once again, the authors of encyclopedia articles are trying to write materials that are authoritative and up to date. So the bibliography in a current encyclopedia is likely to be a good source of background reading. So if you have no idea where to start your reading, finding the bibliography in an encyclopedia article is likely to be a good place to start. Finally, the most useful source of all would be any recent, respected general book about your subject. In other words, for example, in the topic of Picasso, you might want to pick one of the books from the bibliography of the encyclopedia article about Picasso and get that book from your library. You don't necessarily have to read the entire book. In fact, you probably don't want to invest that much time. Instead, skim it and read selected chapters. Anytime you come across a topic that you think might be of interest and might be an appropriate topic for your paper, read what the author has to say about it. Usually, a general, recent introductory book on the subject will provide good background information and tell you in a broad sense what current thinking is about the topic. One of the things you want to avoid is relying on any sources that are outdated and which present ideas which may no longer be considered accurate. So a recent book would usually be your best choice. And of course, any introductory book on a subject that you're studying in school is likely to also include a bibliography, another list of other useful books. So one good book can lead to others. So your background reading might begin with your course textbook and books that you encounter by browsing in the library, as well as an encyclopedia article. And all of these things should lead you to finding one or two good, strong, introductory general books on the subject, which you can dip into, read parts of, skim, and use as a source of good ideas for possible topics that you might want to write about. Now, as you do this background reading, you're going to be looking for the following kinds of things. First, of course, a topic that interests you. If you're interested in the topic, chances are good you'll be able to write a nice paper about it. If the topic bores you and you pick it just because you think it's the kind of thing your teacher might like, chances are good your paper will reflect your boredom and not be very interesting in and of itself. So look for a topic that you actually want to learn more about yourself, and that will lead to a better paper. Second, look for a topic about which a good amount of research material appears to be available. In other words, a topic about which other people have been writing and doing scholarly work. You want to find a topic where there are books, articles, and perhaps other materials that already exist that you can use and draw upon in doing your research and then ultimately your writing. Now, what is a good amount of research material? Well, not too much and not too little. If there's a particular topic which is mentioned in every book and article on the subject, and which everyone seems to have a similar opinion about, then it's probably not an appropriate topic for your paper because the topic has probably been overdone. It is now taken for granted. There's nothing really fresh or interesting to say about it. There's no question that hasn't been answered a million times, and therefore it probably will make a rather boring paper. So a topic that has been written about everywhere is probably not the best for your paper. On the other hand, a topic about which there's very little research material available will be very hard to write a research paper about. Chances are the topic is very obscure, it perhaps is not very interesting or important, and in any case, finding research materials that you can draw upon in doing your writing will be very difficult. So if you stumble upon a topic that interests you, but you find that the bibliographies of the books you look at don't seem to contain any reference materials about that topic, you may be getting a warning there that that's not really going to work. At this stage, it may be tough to tell how much research material is available. When we get into the nuts and bolts of research in later programs, you'll get much more of a sense of how to do that. But it's something to bear in mind as you consider possible topics. You want one where there's a good amount of research material available. Not too much, not too little. Finally, you want a question that seems intriguing and is not obvious, and that's the right scope to be handled in 10 to 15 pages. In other words, neither too broad nor too narrow. As we've seen, there's a big difference in writing a 300-page book versus writing a 10 to 15-page paper. And you want to come up with a question which can be answered adequately in 10 to 15 pages. Notice we haven't said anything about coming up with a thesis. You don't want to try to answer your question yet because you probably don't know the answer to the question. In fact, if you know the answer to the question too early in the research process, that may mean it's a boring question, too obvious and too easy to answer. The whole purpose of the further research you will be doing later on in the process is to answer the question. So don't feel you need to come up with a thesis yet. At this early stage of background reading, you are looking for a good topic and you're looking for an intriguing question, but not yet for a thesis. Let's consider a couple of examples of how you could use your background reading to go from subject to topic to question. Suppose you were taking a science course dealing with the history of science, how scientific ideas emerged and evolved over time, and you were assigned or had decided that you wanted to write about the general subject of the theory of evolution. Okay, it's a very broad subject about which hundreds or thousands of books have been written, and there are many possible topics within that. You would need to do some background reading to narrow that general subject of evolution. Your background reading might begin with a biology textbook or the history of science book that you used in your class. You'd go through it, focus on the sections related to the origins of the idea of evolution, and look for a particular topic that was of interest. You would probably want to grab an encyclopedia and read the related articles about evolution and perhaps about the great evolutionary thinkers, such as, above all, Charles Darwin, the 19th century scientist whose name is most associated with the theory of evolution. And at the end of those encyclopedia articles, you'd find what? Of course, a bibliography, which would recommend some good recent books on the subject. And you could then use your library to find a couple of those introductory books and skim through them in search of interesting ideas. Now, when we went to our library looking for background reading about evolution, here are some of the things that we found. First, we went to the Encyclopedia Britannica and looked at the Propoedia. Remember, that's the one-volume index of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's one volume that gives you guidance on using all the other volumes of the encyclopedia. And what we found is that the Propoedia begins with an 8-page table of contents. That's the first place to look. And this 8-page table of contents divides all knowledge into 10 different subject headings. Part 1 is matter and energy. Part 2 is the earth. Part 3, life on earth, and so on, going through all the areas of human culture and history, all kinds of topics that would be covered somewhere in the encyclopedia. Well, where would evolution be within this 10-part structure? By leafing through it, we can figure out that evolution appears in Part 3, which is headed Life on Earth. And Part 3 is itself divided into 5 different sections, of which the first section, called Division 1, is headed The Nature and Diversity of Living Things. And within Division 1, there are 3 subject headings. Subject heading 311 is Characteristics of Living Things. Subject heading 312 is titled The Origin of Life and the Evolution of Living Things. Aha, we've hit pay dirt. We can then turn to page 96, which is keyed to this particular subject heading, and we'll find there a listing of all the articles elsewhere in the Encyclopedia Britannica that deal with evolution. So if you're looking for evolution or any subject in the Encyclopedia Britannica, start with the Propoedia and find the particular subject heading by going through that detailed table of contents that covers your subject. Turn to that page in the Propoedia, and it will tell you what other articles in the Micropedia and Macropedia are most relevant. So within a few minutes, you'll have pinpointed the specific pages in the broad Encyclopedia Britannica that cover your subject and which would make good background reading. In addition, by browsing on the shelves of our local library for books related to evolution, we were looking for something that would give a good general background in case we were still just beginning our study of the subject of evolution. And in particular, we were interested in material about the history of the theory of evolution. Not so much the details of how it works from a scientific standpoint, but how did Darwin develop the ideas? Who did he borrow information from? Was the idea of evolution something that he created entirely on his own, or did other thinkers contribute to it? So we found a shelf filled with books about evolution, many of which deal with very specific topics that don't really work in relation to our term paper. There are books about the evolution of birds or the evolution of human beings, things which don't really have to do with the general historical background of the theory of evolution. But we did find a couple of books that look appropriate for our background reading. Here are the 2 that I decided to focus on. This one is Evolution, The Remarkable History of a Scientific Theory, written by a man named Edward J. Larson. I picked up the book from the shelf because of that title. The Remarkable History of a Scientific Theory suggests that this book will deal with the origins of the theory of evolution. Where did Darwin get his ideas? How did he develop them? What was the reaction when Darwin first published his books about evolution? And so on. Flipping through it, we see it's a little over 300 pages in length, a manageable length. I won't necessarily want to read every page of this book, although if it's fascinating, I might. But I can flip through it, find particular sections that appear of interest, and see which one of those sections suggests a topic that I might want to write about. Perhaps by spending an hour browsing through this book, I might come up with 3 or 4 topics that seem of interest. Here's another book that I found through serendipity, looking through my library shelf on evolution. It's a book titled Evolution, The Triumph of an Idea. So we can see that this is also going to be about the history of evolution and how evolution came to be the generally accepted idea of how animal and plant species came to be. This is a very different kind of book. You can see it's a much larger book in terms of the trim size of the pages. In terms of page length, it's 360 pages, so it's a little longer. But on the other hand, it's very heavily illustrated, filled with color pictures that relate to evolution. So although it's a heavier book in the literal sense and a larger book than the other book, it's also going to be easy to read because it's got these nice pictures to illustrate what you're learning about and make it easier and more pleasant to read. Once again, because this is a good general background book dealing with the topic in the broadest sense, chances are good that we'll be able to flip through it, find some things of interest, and use those as possible sources of topic ideas. And both of these books happen to have been published within the last 10 years, so they will be reasonably current. They will be up to date in terms of most people's thinking about evolution. So I can use the encyclopedia, I can use background books like these, I can also use a course textbook, and by flipping through all these materials and reading selected sections of them, within a few hours I can probably come up with a couple of topics that might be of interest. Two possible topics that I've thought of in relation to the history of evolution are, one, Darwin's great breakthrough. What does this mean? Well, the question is, what was so unusual and unique about Darwin's presentation of the theory of evolution? Our background reading explains to us that the idea of evolution, the idea that species change over time, was not original with Darwin. In fact, many scientists and other thinkers at the time that Darwin was working accepted the idea of evolution. They all agreed that species changed over time. So evolution itself was not a big breakthrough, and yet Darwin's thinking was revolutionary in some sense. What exactly was revolutionary about it? What was unique? That would be the question that we'll focus on. So we could describe the topic as Darwin's great breakthrough, and the question that we would ask about it is, what was unique about Darwin's contribution to the concept of evolution? So we're not going to analyze the entire theory of evolution. Instead, we're just going to focus on whatever specific element Darwin uniquely contributed. And that's a topic that we could write about in 10 or 15 pages. Here's another example. Suppose you're taking a literature course built around the great novel Moby Dick by the American writer Herman Melville. You'd have to write a term paper, and you'd need to come up with a specific topic and a question and a thesis, which would work for a research paper of 10 to 15 pages. What would your background reading for this assignment be? Well, of course, the novel Moby Dick itself would be part of the background reading. And the chances are good that your edition of Moby Dick that you're reading in class has an introduction or a foreword or an afterword which contains some interesting ideas and evaluation of Moby Dick, which might in itself suggest some topics. Then you could turn to the encyclopedia and read the articles about Moby Dick and about the writer, Herman Melville. And you could also browse or use the bibliography from the encyclopedia to come up with some general books about Melville and about Moby Dick. For example, in my local library, I came upon first this biography of Herman Melville. It happens to be a long 2-volume biography, so it's a very detailed biography, what I think of as a what did he have for breakfast kind of biography, going right down to the level of great detail about Melville's life. This is the first of the 2 volumes, and it covers the period through 1851, which includes the publication of Moby Dick. So this would be the most relevant to our study of that particular novel. Again, I'm not going to read the whole book. I'll browse through it to find some ideas of interest which could lead to a good topic for my paper. A second type of background reading book might be a book like this, New Essays on Moby Dick or the Whale. This is a collection of short pieces by a variety of writers discussing various aspects of Moby Dick. Once again, I wouldn't necessarily read the whole book. I'd simply flip through it, read particular articles or essays that interested me, and maybe come up with a good topic based on what some of these other writers have written about. This is the kind of background reading that could help me develop a good topic and ultimately a good thesis. Based on this background reading, there are a couple of different topics about Melville and Moby Dick that I might come up with. For example, Melville actually worked as a whaler aboard a whaling ship and used some of those real-life experiences in writing Moby Dick. I might be interested in learning more about that, and the biography would certainly help. So one possible topic might be the real-life sources of Moby Dick. And the question that I might ask about that topic is, how did Melville's experiences as a sailor aboard a Pacific whaler shape the novel Moby Dick? Another topic that might be of interest to me might be the symbolism. Many critics have written about Moby Dick and about the fact that the whale itself and the sailors and the ship, all of these elements in the novel all have symbolic meanings, and critics have argued for years about what the exact symbolic meanings are. So I could choose a particular symbol within the entire framework of the novel and make that my topic, come up with a topic such as the great white whale as a symbol of death, an idea that some other critics have set forth. And the question that I would ask is, what exactly is the meaning of the symbol of the white whale in Moby Dick? And how does Melville develop this symbol in the course of the novel? There would be some good background material that I could read about that from other literary critics, for example. And in my 10 to 15 page paper, I would write my own ideas about how Melville uses this particular symbol. A good topic has certain characteristics that you ought to be thinking about as you do your background reading and are jotting down ideas for possible topics. First, a good topic is not merely a narrative. For example, the life of Charles Darwin would not be a very good topic for a term paper for a science class. It's too broad, but in addition, it doesn't lend itself to analysis. Remember, the whole point of a research paper is that you're supposed to express your own ideas, a fresh take on a particular topic. So merely recounting someone's life doesn't work very well as a term paper or research paper topic. Instead, how Darwin's study of finches in the Galapagos Islands influenced his theory of evolution would make a much better topic. It might still have some narrative elements. You might need to spend a couple of pages describing the episode in Darwin's life when he visited the Galapagos Islands and studied the finches. But the main point of the paper would be to analyze how that influenced his theory of evolution and provide your own opinions and ideas and conclusions about that influence, rather than simply telling a story. Second, a good topic is not too broad. For example, suppose you were writing about Melville and Moby Dick. A topic like symbolism in Moby Dick probably wouldn't work well for a 10 to 15 page paper. Most of the elements in the book are symbolic in some sense, and dozens of books have been written about the structure of symbolism in Moby Dick, so you really need hundreds of pages to cover the topic adequately. So the symbol of the white whale in Moby Dick, or the symbol of Captain Ahab's wound, would make a better topic because you could cover that adequately in 10 to 15 pages. When in doubt, you're usually better going with a narrower rather than a broader topic because, again, paradoxically, it's easier to write an interesting paper about a relatively narrower topic. On the other hand, you want to avoid a topic that's too narrow. That would simply be a topic about which there's very little actually to say. If you can adequately discuss the topic in just 2 or 3 pages, then a 10 to 15 page paper is going to feel very padded. So, for example, in that same topic area, the biblical meaning of Captain Ahab's name would be too narrow a topic, I think, for a 10 to 15 page paper. It is true that there's a character in the Bible named Ahab, and Melville probably had that person in mind when naming his main character in his novel, Captain Ahab, but you could probably discuss the meaning of his name in just a couple of pages. There's 1 or 2 points that could be made about it, and that's probably it. So the character of Captain Ahab, yes, that could work as a 10 to 15 page paper. The biblical meaning of his name is probably too narrow and wouldn't work for a research paper. And a good topic has research sources, books, articles, and other relevant materials that can help you learn about the topic. So, for example, suppose you were writing about early humans in the Americas for an anthropology course. A topic like evidence of early humans in our hometown might be very interesting and fascinating, but background material about it is probably not available unless your hometown happens to be one where many archaeological sites have been found. So it probably would be very difficult to research that topic. Evidence of early humans in our home state or our region of the country would be a feasible topic because the chances are good that there is some evidence and some research material about that somewhat broader topic. So when choosing a topic, make sure it's one about which research sources are probably available to be studied and written about. Make sure also that your topic has not been overdone. For example, a topic like what is natural selection has been overdone because whenever you write about evolution, you have to define natural selection. There's really no question about it that hasn't been answered a million times before. Even the shortest encyclopedia article, for example, about evolution will describe the mechanism of natural selection, which is basically how Darwinian evolution works. So writing about what is natural selection probably wouldn't work well for a research paper at this late date. It's been done too many times and therefore is very hard to make interesting. A better topic might be something like, how did the writings of Malthus influence Darwin's idea of natural selection? Malthus was an economist and philosopher who is sometimes said to have influenced Darwin because his writings about how overpopulation led to the death of groups within a population influenced Darwin's thinking about natural selection and helped him come up with this aspect of the theory of evolution. It's a topic that has been written about before, but isn't so commonplace that everyone who writes about evolution mentions it, and therefore that could be suitable for a research paper. And finally, once again, pick a topic that interests you. Trying to reflect your teacher's perceived interests rather than your own usually doesn't work. Okay, we've gotten through the background reading and have come up with a general subject, which we started with, moved from that to a more specific topic, and have come up with some questions that we think might be interesting about the topic that we've chosen. Before we go on to the more detailed research stage of the process, we need a working thesis, a tentative thesis that we're going to use as a basis for our research. And the next thing we're going to talk about in this program is how do you come up with a good working thesis. Remember, your thesis is what you want to say about the topic. It's the answer to the question that you've posed yourself. Rather than simply summarizing what you've read elsewhere, it states your idea, your opinion, your conclusion. Now, before beginning your research, you want to develop a tentative or a working thesis. It's not a definite answer. Instead, it's a possible answer to the question, and it's one that you're going to then test by the research that you're about to do. Think of it as being like the hypothesis that a scientist tests when doing lab experiments or field research. It guides your research because your research can then be built around, is my working thesis true, is it false, or is it in need of modification? The whole point of the research then is to answer that question. Now, what makes a good working thesis? Of course, you don't know at the start whether the thesis is correct or not, so that doesn't matter. What you simply want is a thesis that matches the following three criteria. First, it can be stated in a single clear sentence. Second, it is a positive, non-obvious statement. And third, it can be tested through your research. Let's look at some examples of possible working theses and see which ones meet these criteria and which ones don't, and how to improve the ones that don't work very well. Suppose you were taking an American history or a Black Studies course and you wanted to write a paper about the general subject of Malcolm X, who was, of course, the great civil rights leader, the great black leader who was assassinated in the mid-1960s and who has been the subject of much controversy since his death over the nature of his ideas and how they were evolving. You would do some background reading, of course, including, for example, his autobiography and some books or other materials that have been written about Malcolm X. And at a certain point, you would begin to narrow your focus onto one particular aspect of Malcolm X's life, work, or philosophy. And then you would need to come up with a working thesis that you would then test in your research. Let's look at some examples of good and bad working theses that might or might not serve to guide the research that you would do into the life and thinking of Malcolm X. Try this as a working thesis. Malcolm X's changing attitudes toward racial integration. How does that work as a thesis? Well, actually, this is not a thesis at all. Notice that it's not stated in the form of a sentence. It's simply a phrase describing a general topic area. Therefore, it doesn't match our criteria for a good thesis because it doesn't make a positive statement. the fact that it's not in the form of a sentence is a good clue. It doesn't really say what you're going to say about Malcolm X's attitudes. It simply states that you're going to investigate Malcolm X's changing attitudes toward racial integration. It's more like a topic than a thesis. We could turn this into a good working thesis by rephrasing it this way. Malcolm X's attitudes toward racial integration became more positive during the last 6 months of his life. Okay, now we've stated it in the form of a sentence. It's making a clear statement about a possible position or opinion that we might want to take in our paper, and we could then do research to test whether this is true or not. Were, in fact, Malcolm X's attitudes toward integration changing in the last 6 months of his life? How did they change? We can do reading and research and investigation to determine whether this is true or not. So this makes a good working thesis that could guide our research. Here's another possible working thesis. How well does this work? As a leading figure in African American history, Malcolm X's racial attitudes have importance for all Americans. How does this work as a working thesis? Well, the problem with it is that it's probably too obvious. It's true that Malcolm X is a leading figure in African American history. He's one of those people, along with Martin Luther King Jr., who is talked about whenever African American history is discussed. So simply saying that his racial attitudes are important seems fairly obvious. He's a major figure in history, so his ideas would be worth studying. It's a rather obvious conclusion, and therefore not really a very interesting one to test in your paper. A better working thesis based on this same general area might be something like this. The racial attitudes of Malcolm X were profoundly influential among African Americans during his lifetime. Okay, now this is a less obvious statement. It is saying that before Malcolm X was killed, he had already had a tremendous impact on the thinking of other African Americans. This is something that might be true or might not be true. You could go ahead and test it through your research. You could try to find out how widespread Malcolm's ideas had become by the time of his death. Did many people accept them? Were they controversial? Did many people reject them? Were many people simply unaware of them? How widely were his speeches read and broadcast? That kind of thing. You could really examine this question and come up with either a true or false about it. So it's not an obvious statement like our bad working thesis. It's a good working thesis because it makes a specific, interesting claim which can then be tested by research. Here's another possible working thesis. What do you think of this one? Had Malcolm X lived, his attitudes toward racial integration would have changed dramatically. Actually, there are people who have said this, that in the late 60s, Malcolm X would probably have evolved quite a bit as a thinker. Can we test this through research, however? The problem with this as a working thesis is it's rather difficult to test what might have happened if someone had not died. You could write a very interesting short story or novel imagining a world in which Malcolm X did not die and imagining how he might have evolved as a person and a thinker. But it's rather hard to come up with a definitive answer based on research to a purely speculative question like this. So this probably doesn't work very well as a working thesis for our research paper because it's almost impossible to really test its truth via research. Here's a working thesis, however, that is testable. Some of Malcolm X's leading followers have distorted his racial attitudes. Okay, now we're making a statement about what has happened to Malcolm X's thinking since his death, that some of the people who claim to be his followers have actually distorted his ideas. We could test this by reading Malcolm X's own philosophy and comparing the things he said to the things that his followers said and see, do they really match up, or have the followers taken Malcolm's ideas and distorted or changed them? So this is something which we can do research to test and decide, yes, it's true, or no, it isn't true, as opposed to the bad working thesis, which is not really testable. So remember, as you develop a working thesis, make sure that it makes a clear, positive statement, that it's something that can be researched, that is something that can be tested through research, and that it's not simply obvious, a statement that is clearly true and therefore not very interesting as the basis for your research paper. It doesn't matter too much what you actually state in your thesis, that is, whether it's a positive or a negative, for example, because we don't know at this point whether it's true or not. The point is to make a positive statement of some kind that can in fact be tested. It will then serve as a guidepost for the rest of our research, and the purpose of that research will be to determine, is my working thesis true or false? And you will report your results in the research paper that you ultimately write. Well, now that you've done some background reading, narrowed the broad subject into a more specific topic, and developed a working thesis to test, you're ready to begin your research. And in our next program, we'll tackle the first stages of doing your research.
If you're getting ready to take your SAT, don't forget, your score can make or break your chances of getting into the college of your dreams. That's where Video-Aided Instructions SAT Series, a complete SAT course on DVD, can make all the difference. Our comprehensive SAT series will help you prepare thoroughly with insider strategies for making sense of tough reading passages and sentence completions, mastering the tricky rules of grammar, usage, and mechanics, crafting a well-written, high-scoring essay, unraveling those mind-boggling math problems, avoiding lengthy computations by using proven shortcuts, and much more. Get that all-important edge over the competition with SAT Critical Reading, SAT Writing, and SAT Math. After viewing these exceptional programs, you'll be able to take the stress out of SAT success and maximize your score.